Hi folks, Sven Svensson here, also known as Photo Fisher. In this video I'm going to show you how to make this speaker cabinet. It's a 1x12 cabinet to match my Fender Super Champ X2 cabinet. In this video we'll show you how to make this, so stay tuned. So to make this little 1x12 cabinet, we're going to need quite a few materials and tools. I've got a wiring harness already pre-done for me with the jack plate, so that will take the 1/4 inch input on the back of the amp. A bag of screws and finishing washers, if you can see that there through the shine of the bag, basically just to fix the back baffle. I've got some black. I've chosen black versus silver on this particular cabinet build. Corner rounds. Of course, we finish it off with an authentic Fender emblem that we'll put on the front grille. Got a handle we'll put on top, and I've got some rubber feet. The grille fabric that we've chosen is called wheat, and it will match the Fender Super Champ X2 grille perfectly. And then likewise, I've got some wine-colored Tolex that we'll put on the amp body itself. Of course, to build the cabinet body, you're going to need some straight, good quality pine. And here I've chosen an 8-foot by 10 inch, which ends up being really 9 1/4 as the width. An 8-foot board that I've already pre-marked where I'm going to do the cut for rough cutting, and then I'll trim it to shape to make sure every size of the sides is equal, since this will be a square cabinet. By the way, all the plans and the bill of materials and the tools needed will be provided in a link below this video. Now, you can cut the board with some box joints, or you can just do a straight flush cut. As long as you get a square cabinet, that's your goal. I'm going to do finger joints in this case, very much like what you see in the box for my dado set. So I'm going to be doing that, trying to get as close to the original Fender cabinet construction as possible back in the 1960s, and I'll show you why in a second. Well, of course, you're going to need a finishing sander. Obviously, you want to wear goggles when you do some of this stuff around power tools. You'll need a measuring tape. I suggest using 3M High Strength 90 contact adhesive as a spray. You can use it coming out of a jar and spread it on, but spraying it's a lot easier. Do not use 3M High Strength 77. That just won't have enough of the industrial connection between wood and the Tolex. Instead, use the High Strength 90. We'll need Titebond 3 Ultimate Wood Glue to glue the finger joints together on the cabinet. Of course, the measuring devices. Here's a 90-degree corner clamp that helps with keeping everything square. And finally, we're coming to the gem that we're going to put inside this box. And I have one of two match sets of Jensen special design speakers that came out of Fender units back in the 60s. This happens to be a 1964, the 13th week build, and it's a Jensen C12PS. Alright, this one happens to be built in 1963, the 19th week, and it's a C12Q. Alright, there's a little bit of a difference between the two, and I'll be playing both of those through this cabinet and see which one sounds the best. I also forgot to mention earlier here that you'll need some baffle board for both the front speaker baffle and the rear baffle that either will be a fully enclosed cabinet or a partially enclosed cabinet. It's your choice. This happens to be 3/8 inch plywood, and so we'll use some scrap stuff laying around. Well, I've loosely assembled the box cuts just to give a visual for the next steps. I need to trim these down to length. They're just a little over 17.5 inches long, which happens to be the width of this Fender Super Champ X2. And as you saw earlier, all the materials I purchased will match that cabinet right there. I've assembled the 4 pieces to make the speaker cabinet frame, and I've got a pretty decent fit. I'll glue that up and tighten it and square it up. And here you can see I've got a little bit of a warped board, so I can straighten that with some clamps. But we'll glue that up and square it up, let it sit overnight, and we'll start the next step. I've glued the finger joints together, and I've used just a common cargo strap to kind of tighten it all together. And back here where I had some warping, I used a woodworker's C-clamp here, and kind of pulled that warp together. The rest of this, while it looks ugly now, remember we're going to route the edges and smooth everything out. So this will look pretty nice when it's all sanded and rounded off. The important thing here is to get this thing so it's square on the outside. If you have any warping, as you can see, it's I have a pretty good square box right on that corner. You go over and test all the corners, and you can see it just fits nicely. So we've got a nice square box on the outside. On the inside, if you have any warping or concave or convex type of situation, it's all right. Don't worry about it. As long as your outside is square, then you'll end up with a good cabinet. So the next step is to cut the front and the back baffles. For that I'm going to use pine 3/8 of an inch plywood, and here I have 2 pieces. One on the left is brand new, and the one on the right is approximately 10 to 12 years old, so it's aged a little bit. So I'm going to use the aged piece just to support the myth and the mystery of getting that aged sound out of these Fender cabinets. But before we cut the front and the back baffles, we have to make sure that this thing is square. So I measured from this corner to that corner, and from this corner to that corner, and I'm 1/16 of an inch off. So for this project, I'll consider that pretty square. The inside measurements is exactly 16 inches, just as I would expect. So it's a 16-inch square, and I'm going to cut the baffles out to those measurements, and then do a fine trim for a final fit. Okay, I've saved you all the boredom of watching me cut a square piece of wood. I've cut the front baffle. As you can see, I've cut so that there is about a 1/4 inch gap on the top and a 1/4 inch gap on this right side. So if it were centered, it'd be an 1/8 inch gap all the way around. And that will allow for the Tolex wrap on all 4 sides and the tweed covering on the front baffle, so that it'll be a nice snug fit when it's all said and done. I've also cut the back baffle. And the back baffle I'm ultimately going to cut into thirds horizontally. And the top piece and the bottom piece will be affixed permanently, and I'll opt to remove or put in the middle baffle for a closed cabinet or for an open back cabinet. Okay, now we want to cut out the inside diameter of this speaker cone so that we leave wood exposed enough to affix the speaker to the front baffle board. So how do we do that? is we place a screw in the center, and I've marked the center with some diagonal lines. I've taken some old fly line and I've marked out where 5.5 inches is. So if I do 5.5 inches here and 5.5 inches up here, I've got an 11-inch diameter circle, which is perfect to leave a bit of a lip for the 12-inch speaker and mount it on this board. So we'll go ahead, and I've already started a bit of a line here. You just hold your pencil on that line and just go around. One way to cut this circle is to use a router and a little jig that pivots in the center, and it cuts the perfect circle and leaves a nice clean cut. Since I don't have that jig, I'm going to use a jigsaw instead. And I'll go back and I'll try to do this as smooth as possible, and then I'll smooth it out with a file and some sandpaper. Okay, so there's our front speaker baffle. Not a perfect circle, but certainly leaves enough so that I could screw the back side of the speaker into the front speaker baffle board. Alright, so I've saved the time and trouble of watching me cut these small pieces here, these baffle bracings. So I've cut them, glued them, and installed them for both the front and the back. But there are a couple things to note here. First is the way I oriented them. I put the long pieces on the top and on the bottom, with the short pieces butting up against them top to bottom. Thinking here is that it might be a little more stable if you were to sit on this, since these would act more like a column or a support post. However, since this is only a 17.5 inch by 17.5 inch cabinet, it's sturdy in its own right because it's so small. Now the other thing I want to mention is the front baffle needs to set in a little further than the back baffle, and I'll show you why. In typical Fender fashion, the front baffle has about a 15 millimeter distance between the front edge of here and the speaker grill itself. So I've allowed for that 15 millimeters here, plus the 3/8 of an inch, which is about another 1 millimeter. So to install this, from this edge to the back bracing here for the baffle, is about 25 millimeters or 2.5 centimeters. All right, and I did that all the way around. Now for the back baffle, let me show you the distance that it is offset from front lip to back bracing. It's a little bit different. In the back of Fender amps, they're pretty much flush here with just an ever so slight indentation. All right, so I've allowed for that, basically offsetting those bracings by about 3/8 of an inch, the width of the plywood backing that I'm going to use. Now that we have the basic cabinet built, we want to put a 1/4 round bead on the outside edge of both the front and the back. Don't do any inside trim work. We'll leave those square, and that will be traditional to Fender's original design. Now it's time to do a little bit of pre-assembly. We're going to assemble the front speaker baffle board to the inside baffle stops using a T-nut and a matching bolt to go inside that T-nut. Now the hosel of that T-nut, this is a 1/4 inch bolt by the way, the hosel is 5/16. So I've got a drill prepared with a 5/16 inch bit, and I'm going to drill in each of these corners to affix this board, and then we'll see how sturdy it is. I might add more in the center so it doesn't vibrate, but we'll see how non-vibrating it can be. And then another option is to also put some felt or something behind here to prevent the vibration of wood to wood. So that's another option if these four corners are sturdy enough. Now that I have my 4 holes drilled, I've pounded the T-nuts in by laying this on concrete and then taking a rubber mallet and just tamping it in place so I don't split the wood, and then giving it a final few hard pounds to secure them in place. Now that the T-nuts are in place, I'm going to pre-mount the speaker. So I've drilled 4 holes, probably can't see it on camera here, for these wood screws with a washer to hold the speaker onto the speaker board. If I need to add more after I test it to see if there's any vibration, I can always add more screws here to make it more tight, but I think 4 will do it for now. So now the front speaker baffle is complete. I've affixed it with the T-nuts and the machine screws from the back side, and the speaker I affixed to the back side using some small screws. You can see the drill holes right here where I drilled through as a pilot hole to put the screws in. So let's take a look at the back and see what it looks like. So you can see where I affixed the front baffle board to the baffle stops, and you can see where I fixed the speaker to the baffle board using screws and washers. Here I've cut the 1-inch strips of felt. This is 1mm felt, really don't need much. I've pre-cut them. All I have to do is just lay them on the tape now that's already applied on the inside. So I'll just go ahead and lay that in there and tamp it down. That's not going anywhere. So with a Sharpie, I've marked each one of the holes where I need to burnish the felt and the tape through. So we'll go ahead and start that process, and it's pretty quick and easy. I've spray painted the silver T-nuts flat black to match the rest of the baffle board, and I've spray painted both sides. That way I'm assured that the front baffle board won't be seen through any fabric or even from the back side if you really want to take a look at it closely. Next thing that I'm going to do is, as you can see, this is the back side of the amp cabinet, and I've placed my 3 baffle boards in the back. For an open back design, that's how I'll assemble it. And if you want a closed back design, you put this piece back in here. As you can see, that back baffle board stop is still unfinished pine wood. So I'll spray paint this lip here all the way around. I'll spray paint that black as well, so that when these are upholstered and put back in here, you won't see the wood. Now it's time to get prepared to apply the Tolex to the speaker cabinet frame. You want to prepare your Tolex so that you have a square edge to start with, or I should say a straight edge that is square to the edge, the long edge of the Tolex. That will help us in starting and aligning the Tolex to wrap around the frame. Let's speak about how to wrap the Tolex. You have several options. I highlight this in the drawings here that I'll provide in the links below the video. But you can do a one-piece wrap, which means you start at the bottom of the amp and wrap all the way around in one piece. You can do a two-piece wrap, where you start at the lower edge, wrap around, and then you have one piece that overlaps on the bottom. The Fender way is to wrap from the top down to the bottom and overlap an inch or so on each side, and then put a piece on top of it on the bottom and the top. And we're going to do it this way so that we are as close to authentic as possible in how we construct this cabinet. I have several Fender amps, some new and some vintage. And I've measured the overlap distance, and in all cases it's 1 3/8 inches. So that's what we're going to do for our overlap to be as close to vintage as possible. On the top of the amp and on the bottom of the amp, I've marked a line at 1 3/8 of an inch. And I've also marked the center. And we'll show you what that means in a second here when we start wrapping the Tolex. But this will be the starting point for the edge of the Tolex, which I have squared off and cut with a razor blade. A very clean line you can see right here. Very clean line. And it'll give us a nice square edge to get started. To measure the width of Tolex I'll start a piece of tape here, wrap it around and all the way around back into that back lip, and if I peel this off, now I have the complete width of Tolex I'm going to need to apply to the side faces of this cabinet. This particular Tolex, which happens to be the leatherette wine, comes in an 18-inch width. And so here's the piece that I took off of the cabinet, the width that I'll need to wrap the edge of the cabinet. And I was hoping this would be the case, and it is, that there'll be enough left over on this excess strip as I cut down here to wrap my back 1/3 baffle boards. So I'll be able to use the complete width of this Tolex without too much waste. I'll take this piece of pre-measured masking tape and move it down periodically throughout this piece of Tolex and make some marks. In this case, I'm making a mark about 1/4 inch longer than what I need, just to give myself some room for error. And I'll draw a line, cut that with a straight edge, and we'll have a piece that's just the perfect width to wrap around the cabinet body. Using the same trick with masking tape to measure the lengths and the widths of the Tolex you'll need, I've placed a piece of masking tape on that line, wrapped it around and underneath to the line on the other side from our overwrap. And what that looks like when it's all said and done is a strip of tape that's about that long. And I'm going to cut along that line. It happens to be the top edge of this tape. And then cut a line along here that's nice and square. And that will be my first piece of Tolex cut and ready to wrap. So there's the first piece of Tolex that we've cut for the left side of the speaker cabinet. And it's worth mentioning that you should make measurements for the length and the width of the piece of Tolex that goes on the left and the right side. Make those measurements separately with separate pieces of tape. Remember that center line we put on the cabinet? We'll also want to put a center line so that these two match when we affix the Tolex to the cabinet with real glue. Right now it's just taped on so I can do a pre-measurement. But I've allowed myself enough so I can wrap around and go underneath and cover this underneath edge here straight to the baffle board. And likewise, I've done it the same way here. I've given myself enough room so that when I wrap around, it's going to come in and go under this lip here, straight back to the baffle board. Now the inset for this baffle board, remember, is deeper than in the back. All right, this happens to be the back baffle, where the back baffles will go. So the distance here for overlap is going to be less than the distance here for overlap. That's why we want to center this up so that when we apply our glue, we know we've got our piece aligned properly for our total wrap. I've test fit my piece of Tolex so that I've stretched it pretty tightly from one end to the other, and it lines up pretty nicely to that 1 3/8 inch overlap that occurs on the sides of those traditional Fender amps. And I've made a mark here in the center on both sides so that as I stretch this Tolex and do the initial wrap, that I've lined it up properly. One thing to note, just before you affix the Tolex to the cabinet frame, is you want to make sure that there's no debris on this cabinet frame. Any little speck or piece of sawdust or a grain of sand or anything that you have on that will be magnified when the Tolex is rolled on here. I've applied some spray adhesive to the back of the Tolex to get started, and just to the cabinet frame area along this line and just a little bit over. And that'll help me get started, get it aligned, and then I'll spray the rest of this and finish applying the Tolex on this one side. Okay, I've glued this end and I've loosely pressed it in place. We'll roll it in place here in just a second. But before I glue the rest of it, I just want to make sure I have it aligned. So here I've taped this and stretched it so that the other end lines up properly as well. So now I have it completely square on here. And by the way, don't worry if you get some adhesive on the Tolex as you put this project together. We can remove that later. Now with a small roller, we just want to roll this in place so it's nice and firm. This will remove any air bubbles that might be in the Tolex and give us a nice good start. I've applied that one side strip, and my alignment came out nice there where I started, and the alignment came out nice where I finished. Maybe just a little short of that line, but that's okay. I'm not too worried about that. That's about 1/16 of an inch. So nice and smooth, and we'll go ahead and repeat that step for the other side, which is now on the bottom here. But we'll do the sides, and then we'll cut a piece to do the top. After all that's done, then we'll start applying adhesive and rolling this over. Now that I've got both sides put on, I'm going to work on the top and the bottom, and that's a little easier. For the top and bottom, you'll want to cut this piece here so that this wraps over and is flush with this edge. Alright, same way here, I'll wrap this down and I'll just cut here to the edge of this board. Alright, and the wrap of the top Tolex is from the edge of this board over to the edge of this board here, and that's our length. Alright, so that'll be the overwrap that's traditional to Fender amps. If you recall, the distance from the inside of this cabinet wall to the inside of this cabinet wall is roughly 16 inches if everything is square, and mine is spot on. So the fabric that I cut from here to here will be 16 inches long, and the width of this board, so they can wrap around from here and clear wrap around back in the back. And I've already have that piece of tape measured, so I'll lay out the piece that goes on here with the tape for the width and 16 inches long. Now what's important when you do the top piece is that this edge here, oops, sorry, you can get it on the camera here, this edge here and this edge here are completely square and straight. Alright, and then you can just easily line it up this way and apply your glue. Alright, I've aligned that up nicely. Both edges are nice and square and following the inside of the cabinet. It's time to just roll it in place. Now it's time to prepare the corners so that we can wrap them around and fix them in. It's pretty simple. We'll just split the difference between where the round edge starts and finishes. Just make a mark with your fingernail. Alright, then you take some scissors and cut perpendicular to that mark, perpendicular to this edge here, to that mark. That's all we have to do on each corner. Then we can start doing some wraps, and I'll show you how to finish that off. Remember that we'll be putting some corner protectors on all corners of this cabinet body, so the wrap and the overlap here isn't too critical in terms of how it looks, because we'll be covering it up. I've applied some spray adhesive to the inside flap of the Tolex and to the around the edge here up to the baffle board. I used a piece of cardboard that I cut 16 inches wide to place down in here and mask out not getting the glue on here, but getting the glue on here, and I did that on all four sides. So I'm ready to wrap this around and finish the corners. So if you can see here, I've cut this piece away from the main overlapping piece here so that I can wrap it down and fold it over into the backing baffle board stop here. I just go ahead and work myself all the way down, pressing it in, making sure that's a nice round tight rollover. Now we've wrapped the Tolex around and got a nice bead here. We'll do a couple cleanup maneuvers now in the corners. And all we do is just cut right here diagonally from that corner into the crease, and then we'll peel apart the underlying wraps of Tolex, and this should be a nice 45-degree miter on this corner. Once you have your corners mitered, take a small square block and go along the edges and just make sure that everything is sealed and nice and square in here. And if you want, you can see that it's not quite even here for me. I could take a razor blade and cut along here so that I have a nice flush cut here. I might leave it for now and see how the baffle boards fit, since this is the back side, and then opt to cut it later. Next thing we'll want to do is cut the Tolex pieces for the back 3 pieces. So I've spaced that out here. I'll do a cut, and we'll affix this the same way and do miter quarters the same way as we did with the main cabinet. For one of the back panel baffle boards, I've sprayed the back of it, and I've also sprayed the Tolex just like I've done before. I'm going to place this on here now and just wrap the corners around and miter them off like we did before. Now that I've got one baffle done, Let's just see how it fits before we do the rest. And that's just perfect. It's just a little bit of a snug feel to it. The next step is to put the corner protectors on the cabinet. I'll use a small black Phillips head screw to affix these to each of the corners, and I'll drill a pilot hole for each one. So make sure you have that set exactly where you want it, and go ahead and drill a pilot hole. Be careful when you start the drilling process so you don't take the Tolex and wrap it around the drill bit. One thing to note is on the bottom of the cabinet, I put rubber feet and used the same screws and just inserted the rubber feet on the 4 bottom corners. And so now we have our cabinet protectors on the corners installed, ready for the next step. The next step is to install the speaker grill cloth. I've marked out where I want to cut this with masking tape. I'm going to cut along this masking tape with scissors and leave the masking tape there. It'll help the fraying of these fibers. It's rather stiff. It's not like cloth. It's more like fabric that you would put on a outdoor chair, for example. It's all very thick nylon. So we'll cut that, and to prevent any fraying, that masking tape will help us. All right, it's time to install the speaker grill cloth onto the speaker baffle. But here it's really important to know which is the top and which is the bottom of your baffle board. And I've marked it ahead of time so I know that that's the top. And I want this Fender wheat fabric, speaker grill fabric, so that the brown lines are going horizontal, not vertical. So I've aligned that up, and I've also aligned the bottom edge of a board on one of those brown lines so that I can make sure that these lines are perfectly square and perpendicular, depending on how you measure it, between the bottom and top edges of the speaker baffle board. I've used some rocks here from my landscaping to help hold this down steady as I pull and just snug it as I staple it. I'm using 1/4 inch staples, just a standard hand staple gun. And I'm going to work from the center going out and just stretch it tautly, but not so much that you're pulling the fabric out from underneath the boards. That's why I have the weights here to help me from, to prevent me from doing that actually. So, all right, let me start here. I'll work from the center and move out. Then I'll go to the opposite side and do the same thing. And then we'll take our next steps. Now we'll want to cut some relief off of these, just like we did when we wrapped the Tolex onto the speaker cabinet. So I'm basically going to cut out a square, and I'll do it like this. Like that. There. So now I can wrap this around like this and form a nice little square angle here. Now that the speaker grill cloth is in place, we need to burnish holes where those T-nuts are so that we can affix the baffle board to the frame. But it's kind of difficult to see where those holes might be. So how do you know? Well, shine a flashlight through that, and you'll want to burnish the hole through just the back side. Be very careful not to burnish the hole through the front side. After you spend all this hard work lining this grill cloth up and making it look nice, you don't want to burn a hole in it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead off camera and burnish a hole in each of these areas where the screws will go, or the bolts will go through the T-nuts. So I've burnished the holes to access the T-nuts using a soldering iron, just like I used the soldering iron to burnish a hole through the felt baffle on the front. Alright, now that we have the speaker grill cloth on, I'm going to fix the speaker to the baffle board, and then we'll do a test fit to put this in place. Okay, let's give it a go. Pop this thing into place and screw it in from behind. Now we can affix the baffle boards to the back of the cabinet. I've marked and pre-drilled pilot holes where I want these finishing washers and black screws to go into the back baffle stops and to hold these two boards in place. Now let's install the speaker cable jack. I've marked a cross in the center of this board, and I've found that a hole saw will fit that recess portion just perfectly. So what you don't want to do, however, is just start cutting away, because you'll tear away the Tolex. Instead, we need to cut that very smoothly and rid a good portion of that as close to that circle as possible, this circumference, and then we'll just drop this right in and it'll cover up just nicely. And the last thing we'll do is put the handle on top. And so I've centered this handle both this way and this way. And so I'll mark where those holes will be drilled for the screws. So here's the other thing that you'll want to take notice of, is that there's slots on this handle. And that's when you lift in here and pull, that it will slide back and forth just a little bit on each edge. And so I've put the first hole as far forward as I possibly can on that slot, so that when the screw is in here and I lift up, I have a little room to slide. And the kit comes with tiny little T-nuts. So I'm going to have to drill a hole to fit the hosel of that T-nut and go clear through the cabinet, pop that on the other side, and then we have machine head bolts to go down through that T-nut. Alright, I drilled a pilot hole, and then I drilled a hole large enough to fit the hosel of this little tiny T-nut. So we'll put those in there, and we'll pound them in place, and we'll be able to fix the handle to the top side. The last thing we'll do is put on some finishing touches with a nice brushed aluminum Fender logo. Here I've used an official Fender brushed aluminum logo with a brown fill for the swoosh. The Super Champ X2 amp that this cabinet is meant to accompany actually has a smaller version of this. It is brushed aluminum, but it has the black fill. But I like the brown fill better for two reasons. One, it matches the color scheme here very nicely. And secondly, it pays homage to the 1963 Jensen / Fender special design speaker that's inside this box right now. So I think that's takes it back into the old days era, and this will look really nice. So let's place this on. I've measured, by the way, several Fender logos on the amp faces, on cabinet faces, and there's not a consistent measurement from this depth and this depth. What is consistent is that the stem of the D and the stem of the N are perfectly up and down. So if you do that and then just make this equal proportions here, this happens to be about 3/4 of an inch on both sides, you'll have a nice logo placement that looks pretty consistent with the real thing.